that is as red a flag as this book is to witches. It is not subtle. No. Insane. Hey y'all, it's Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today. And for this video, I am once again going to be doing a feminism reading vlog to celebrate Women's Empowerment Day. All right, before we get into anything bookish, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments what's the best book you've read lately that has strong feminist themes. So I'm pretty sure this is like year 4 of me doing these feminist reading vlogs, and I always end up having some of the best books of the year in these vlogs, meaning I had to do one again. It was just a necessity. Last year, I only read nonfiction books, but I did stumble across a fiction book that I had so many thoughts about how women were presented in it and the themes that were woven throughout the story that I had to insert it in here. And that was Nightbtch by Rachel Yoder. So this is following a woman who is a stay-at-home mom, and though she loves her child, she loves her partner, she is unfortunately kind of starting to lose herself until one day she thinks she might be turning into a dog. Listen, I know this is super weird, but I loved everything about this. I had so many thoughts on it. As I said, we're gonna dive into those moving forward in the vlog, but we're still in the intro stages. Apart from this one, I did also end up reading a short pamphlet that actually packed a really solid punch, and that was Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, A History of Women Healers by Barbara Einrich and Deirdre English. Specifically, I read the 90s version, which had been modified and updated a little bit. As I said, it's a pamphlet, meaning it's a very quick read, but it was really impactful, and it specifically focuses on the time in history when there was a shift in the cultural view of women being healers to men taking over the practices and industry. Let's go ahead and roll the vlog. Hey y'all, so honestly, I was not anticipating starting into this video yet, but I picked up this book randomly and realized it would work very well for this video and decided, well, why not? Let's kick it off really. So I started into Nightbtch by Rachel Yoder, and I knew going into this one that we were following a woman who's a stay-at-home mom and believes she is turning into a dog. Almost immediately upon starting the audiobook, I had numerous things that I ended up bookmarking because I was like, oh, you're gonna come back and annotate that. So far I can say I don't think this is like the most subtle of metaphors, but even still, I'm really liking what the author is doing here, where we're following this woman who we don't even have her name. We initially know her as the mother, and then after there is a change in her that she starts to accept a little bit more, she literally starts referring to herself as Nightbtch. And as I said, she is a stay-at-home mom, just feeling completely unsatisfied with the monotony that her life has become, very unfulfilled with this role, but it was the one that made the most sense for their family. And she also unfortunately feels very underappreciated by her husband. It starts in a way where like I feel as though this woman is just going through a bout of depression, unfortunately, but the more we see of her circumstances, the more it's clear that it's like, no, this is not just a sudden bout. This is unfortunately a building of different things in society that is leading her to live this life that she hates. It is very wrapped up in her role as a mother, inability to feel like an individual anymore. She is no longer a person, she is a caretaker, and she has to constantly fight the Sisyphean battle of keeping up the house, keeping up appearances, taking care of her child, pleasing her husband, and she just doesn't have the wherewithal to really do it anymore. And I love that there's this play with her turning into the dog of how she is starting to push against modern views of womanhood and is almost falling back into like these really base instincts of just taking care of her kid and the immediate needs in that moment and like having fun and not taking things so seriously. But then at the same time, it's also been kind of interesting that since she's had that change, she almost has this not like other girls feel to her, which I'm very intrigued to see if that's Yoder like purposefully doing that to kind of add another layer to this discussion, or if it was just an accidental fall into that trap. But I think this is doing a really great job of showcasing how there's so many elements of being a woman and being a mother that you are just inherently assumed to do. It's just expected of you. And a lot of people fall into that and continue that and perpetuate that stereotype, and how it makes it so much easier for men like her husband to kind of continue to assume the same thing, and makes him so unappreciative of how much she does. It's got good elements of like the sweat equity in a relationship and being open with your partner and communicative, and also just like aware of them. Like there are certain moments where they have an occasional cute thing, but then there's other times where it's like, I don't understand how you're still married to this man. There's been a few drops here or there that I'm like, that's a red flag. That is as red a flag as this book is. And so I am very intrigued as far as like the plot goes, if that's going to be addressed, if the author is showcasing to us that her husband is not a great guy, and she unfortunately has just come to accept these little red flags as part of his charm and part of the norm for him. But because he is, just slightly over the barrier of being a bad dude, that she's come to just accept all of this stuff. And that because at the very least he is a good provider, that she has just come to accept all of these other issues in their relationship. So I am really enjoying it so far. I just don't 100% know where things are going, and I really like it for that. I also like that once she has this like mental break, this mental change, the way she views her relationship with her son also changes, and the relationship she has with him starts to improve as well. I guess looking back on the not like other girls element, there's also this ongoing part of how she can't help comparing herself to other women, not just when it comes to, like how you look, but also their role as a mother, and if they are able to continue living a life where they have a working job and then also are a mom, how that constant comparison kind of feeds into this like almost competitive nature of being the best mom, being the best provider, being the best caretaker, being able to do it all, while at the same time maintaining this, beautiful, thin, perfect lifestyle. And so I guess with that moment when she does finally start to not care, she is still comparing herself to these other women, but like, is it in a way where like she is comparing and no longer cares about the differences? Or is it comparing to how they are still keeping up this competition and staying in the rat race, as it were? I don't know. It's an interesting thought now that I think about it. But yeah, like I said, this is going really good for me. I'm really enjoying it. I didn't think I was going to start this video so early, but like I said, here we are. It just worked out so well. I mean, I'm liking this. I'm liking it a lot. Hello, my loves. So I have officially finished out Nightbtch by Rachel Yoder. Please ignore my bookmark. That is because I still need to transfer a few last annotations, but I really liked this. It is not subtle. I mean, it is quite on the nose about the themes that are woven into this, but I really liked everything this author had to say. I do think it was beneficial for me to listen to the audiobook of this, because when flipping through it, I found that there's not really quotation marks when there's dialogue. Every once in a while there will be, and it's kind of like a strange distinction of when it happens, and I'm not a big fan of the whole lacking punctuation thing. I feel like that really would have bugged me if I read this physically, so again, shout out to the audiobook. Though I'm still not 100% sure whether or not our main character was actually transforming into a dog or not. I do think the way the dog was used for her to reestablish her own identity and kind of figure out what steps she wants to take to finally move forward and no longer be only this caretaker, purely responsible for, ensuring her son survives, was really interesting. And I did like that as she became happier with herself, the relationship she had with her family members also improved. I'm still not 100% sure whether I was viewing the husband in too harsh a light, because at the start, it really seemed as though there were red flags here or there that she might possibly be ignoring in the guise of trying to not seem like an ungrateful wife and partner. But I did think the way that was done after she has made this change, when she finally starts to stand up for herself and realize that the work she puts into taking care of their house and taking care of their child is just as important and just as much a job as him going off to work. Even if she's not necessarily bringing in funds, her contributions still count. And once she has that shift in perspective, she isn't afraid to actually, ask for assistance, ask for help. But I did like that. But again, I still feel like the way the husband's initially presented, not necessarily 100% a good guy. But at the same time, I mean, like, is the mother necessarily a good person? Because there are some things she does with her son at points where it's like, if a teacher heard about that, they might be calling CPS. Another thing that I didn't really expect when it was initially introduced through a different mother that Nightbtch ends up meeting at one of those like toddler time at the library. She ends up interacting with some other moms and they're talking about these herbs. And initially I didn't realize it was actually a multi-level marketing scheme. Like, I don't think this is really spoilers, but it was such an unexpected element to be worked in and showcased how these groups prey on women who are stay-at-home moms, don't have an active income, and have this rhetoric that is so focused around like empowerment. In reality, it like manipulates them into falling into this scheme and, you know, putting a bunch of money into it and not really finding that independence that they go in wanting. I didn't expect that, but I really liked how it was included in here. Again, tying back to the fact of Nightbtch's character trying to find this independence and this identity for herself and seeing that she is not alone in this. Other mothers are struggling with it as well and take different avenues to try and find that. And so I thought the connection of those two was really cool. Like I said, I didn't initially anticipate it when it was introduced, but there's a clever way to do that. And I think that also ties back to something I mentioned in my prior update, is this sort of unspoken competition that not just mothers, I mean, parents across the board, I think can fall into this, but I definitely think there's a lot more of it in motherhood because of this whole perceived like being the perfect mom, having it all together. And if you're not necessarily working, like, you have an easier life and therefore you don't have an excuse to not have everything figured out and worked out and this picture perfect lifestyle going on. And even though her son actually doesn't seem like he's a bad child, I'll say, still can get overwhelmed, still can be overstimulated. And there are certain elements where it's clear whilst raising this kid, she's taken shortcuts to make her immediate life easier that are making her long-term life more difficult. For example, like, they didn't do sleep training. They're having a hard time with taking his binky away, with potty training, stuff like that, where she keeps giving in because it makes her life right now easy, but in the long run, it's making things so much harder on her. And again, I thought that was like a good parallel to her losing her identity just across the board. I really liked what Yoder did here. And though I am obviously not a parent, I could still connect with certain elements of the story, having taken care of my nibblings and seeing some of these and like family members or people around me. It was very artsy and very weird. And like I said, not the most subtle, but all of it worked together so well for me that in the end, this came out to a very strong 4.5 stars. It definitely had some really solid writing. And there's a reason I have so many annotations, and I will be returning to this. Like I said, I did really like this. I'm so glad I finally got around to reading it. Hey y'all, so I kind of spur of the moment ended up picking up my second book for this video, and that's so funny. Like, usually I have this video so planned out in advance. This year it's been really off the cuff as like what books I ended up deciding were going to work for this vlog. So this morning I finished out Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, a history of women healers. I believe this was originally a pamphlet that was published in like the 70s, and it really kind of went around feminist circles and women who were in the medical field. However, I think they did an update on it about like 10-ish years ago now, where the authors reflect on how things have changed in the time since this was originally written and the research that's been done around history of medicine and witches and healing women that may have changed some of the things they had previously posited in the original pamphlet. But I also appreciated that they acknowledged hindsight's 2020. There were some times where maybe they generalized a little bit too much, or other times where their language was too broad. And there were some times when they spoke in extremes or absolutes, and that's not necessarily always the case. So I did actually really appreciate that, because especially towards the end of the pamphlet, I did have those thoughts where it's like, I get what you're saying here. I like this, but I think you could have added more to this to better explain your point or to acknowledge the additional elements that affect this, that sort of stuff. Personally, I didn't really know too much about the history of medicine when I went into this book, and now I actually do want to do a little bit more research into it because of some of the claims they brought up. For example, let's see. The central idea was that the medical profession as we knew it had replaced and driven out a much older tradition of female lay healing, including both midwifery and a range of healing skills, while closing medical education to women. And later on, they talked about how the creation of medical schools and these institutions, and then eventually these standardized practices that they tried to use across these schools, really set boundaries against women from entering into this industry, and then actually made it illegal for any women who were still practicing, specifically around midwifery, so that they could no longer do so. But at the same time, off of that, it also then put barriers around the people who were receiving care, who could actually afford care, because the people who initially were entering into these medical institutions and then the people they were treating came from the middle and upper class. There is a mention about how before these, there were smaller and more specific colleges that would be open to women or people of color, but unfortunately they could not continue to operate once there was some of these laws and regulations put into place. But at the same time, by doing that, it did help to prevent people from practicing medicine who really did not have any knowledge or actual experience, people who were in fact dangerous criminals and quacks and snake oil salesmen. So that was one of those elements where I could see both sides of it, and I would actually really enjoy to learn more about both sides of that. Of course, one of the more interesting elements that did immediately draw me to this is the ties between these women healers to witches. I actually really appreciate that a lot of evidence these women used was from documents that were present and pointed to during witch hunts. So there is a solid section of the pamphlet that is dedicated to discussing witch hunts that took place in England, in Germany. It's definitely more focused in Europe, and it's hard to talk about those without diving into the fact that one group that was particularly important in witch hunts was the church. I'm going to read off one section that I thought was really interesting. The church saw its attack on peasant healers as an attack on magic, not medicine. The devil was believed to have real power on earth, and the use of that power by peasant women, whether for good or evil, was frightening to the church and state. The greater their satanic powers to help themselves, the less they were dependent on God and the church, and the more they were potentially able to use their powers against God's order. Magic charms were thought to be at least as effective as prayer in healing the sick, but prayer was church sanctioned and controlled, while incantations and charms were not. Thus, magic cures, even when successful, were an accursed interference with the will of God, achieved with the help of the devil, and the cure itself was evil. And later on, the witch healer's methods were as great a threat as her results. For the witch was an empiricist. She relied on her senses rather than on faith or doctrine. She believed in trial and error, cause and effect. One other bit that I thought was really entertaining with that was when they were discussing how these witches would meet in these groups, their covens, but in the church's eyes, of course, this meant that they were communing with the devil, and he was telling them what to do, and therefore they could then go off to enact his whims on the godly men around them. I can't find it now, but there was one line that was like, of course, even these evil women couldn't actually be responsible for whatever evil they were being accused of doing. It had to come from a man. So then off of that, they then move forward in history and talk about the rise of the medical profession. And with that was the male takeover of medicine. And of course, how did they get backing? How did they get the money to put into this to, try and move forward, to do more research, to actually improve? They turned it into a business. The set of healers who became the medical profession was distinguished not so much by its associations with modern science as by its associations with the emerging American business establishment. It was the Carnegies and Rockefellers who intervened to secure the final victory of the American medical profession. And continuing forward, of course, as feminist movements started to grow, there's also a pushback against that when it comes to medical practices. And I actually learned about the health movement that took place in the 1830s and 40s, which I'd never heard of before. Women were the backbone of that group. Ladies' physiological societies were the equivalent of our Know Your Body courses. The emphasis was on preventative care as opposed to cures, which were being practiced by doctors, but still didn't have enough backing to actually showcase that these cures were beneficial. As I said before, when it came to these medical institutions that were established, the people that were actually able to attend to them were often from the middle class. So even once women did start to actually make some progress, unfortunately, it was still only open to women from the middle class. And let's be real, pick-me's are not exactly a new phenomenon. So unfortunately, eventually those women also started to turn their backs on the feminist movement that helped them get as far as they were. So then there's another jump forward, and the next main topic is when midwifery was unfortunately officially outlawed. In 1910, about 50% of all babies were delivered by midwives, and most were Black people or working class immigrants. And whenever there was this push by the medical societies to basically perform a smear campaign against these midwives. They blamed them for the increase in uterine infections and blindness due to maternal infection of gonorrhea. Both of those could very easily be treated if the midwives knew how to treat them, but rather than the medical community sharing that information and, possibly helping to save the lives of mothers and their children, instead they just used it to reinforce their campaign against midwives. And this was wild going off of that. A study by a Johns Hopkins professor in 1912 indicated that most American doctors were actually less competent than the midwives. Not only were the doctors themselves unreliable about preventing sepsis and that blindness, but they also tended to be too ready to use surgical techniques, which endangered the mother and the child. Insane! So then it does talk about the utilization of nurses and nurses becoming more widespread in the medical community. Even from there, the women who sort of helped to really popularize those roles were women who were middle class, had the ability and freedom to take those roles on. Obviously, I know it's one of those things that comes from the time. The way they sort of started to showcase that women were perfect for these roles is because women are mothers, and therefore we have a more natural inclination towards caretaking. And along with that, I guess like cleanliness and housekeeping. And unfortunately, with the increased availability of nurse roles, the number of female nursing students absolutely skyrocketed, but the number of women attending medical school plummeted. And the last part that kind of ties back to my synopsis that I gave earlier was with nurses being present in medical institutions, it kind of increased this holistic approach towards medicine, because doctors usually would not take the time and care to actually apply all of that to their patients. It would be the nurses who were doing so. So with that, I will officially wrap this up because I feel like I've been talking for so long. But again, I just really enjoyed this. It was such a short, fascinating read that, like I said, has me itching to learn more about the medical history of America and just like the medical field in general and women's place in it. And reading this makes me feel so much better about the numerous women that are in the medical field nowadays. And again, this return to a more holistic approach to medicine and treating the actual person and not just the injury or the malady that they are suffering from. Especially over the last few years, being a lot more exposed to the medical industry and seeing the drastic difference of experiences you can have with doctors. And after COVID, I also think that thankfully nurses were being more appreciated for the roles they have and the roles they take. And hopefully that does continue. Really recommend this one. Very interesting. I've also added a few more of these authors' works to my TBR after reading this. And I'm definitely going to go through the bibliography and check out some of the other work they referenced when creating this pamphlet, because so much of it is just so wow. When I first finished it, I thought this was going to be a 4-star because I was wanting more. But given the fact that this was just a pamphlet when it was originally published, I think I'm going to give it 5 stars because what was there was really good. And it was just enough to tickle my taste buds and make me wanting for more.